Hello folks, and welcome to the channel, or welcome back. And in this video we're going to talk about the camshaft. I have often people coming to me asking me what kind of a camshaft they should fit in their engine. And to be very honest, I can't answer that question. It's a little bit like asking what kind of shoes should I put on. If I don't know if you're going to run, or you're going to walk, or you're going to go to a ceremony, or you're going to walk in the mud, I can't tell you if you have to wear gym shoes, if you have to run running shoes. I can't tell you. I need to know for what purpose and for what use you're going to need those shoes. And the same thing is true for a camshaft. So I hope by the end of this video that I will have been able to explain a bit more about the camshaft and what to look for and how to select one for your specific purpose and use. Yeah, and I know I like to use those two words, but it is a reality. So let's have a look on a camshaft, see what it's used for, and then we're going to get into the details. We're going to read the camshaft spec sheet, and I'm going to try to explain what happens with different cams and how they affect different power bands. The whole purpose of a camshaft is to control the valves in the way that they open up at the right time for an exact time, so that we can fill up the cylinder to the maximum possible extent with the air-fuel mixture. And of course, on the exhaust stroke, we want to evacuate these burden fumes as fast as possible out of that cylinder. And that is the whole purpose of the camshaft. Obviously, the camshaft has to be timed in relationship to your crankshaft, because it's the crankshaft that is driving the camshaft. And typically, the camshaft is running half the speed of the crankshaft. Now don't worry about this, I'm going to show you all this in a demonstration, but now first of all let's have a look on a camshaft itself. So here we have a typical camshaft which is normally fitted on the top of the engine, and then we talk about an overhead camshaft or on the side of the engine. And then you have followers and you have rockers, you have all kind of things, but we're not going to get into that today, because right now we're talking about the camshaft itself and its various specifics. If you look close on a camshaft, you will see these cams. There's two cams here, two cams, and two cams. This part in the middle here on the outer edges, that's just for the bearing. This is where the cam actually rotates inside the engine, like so. And while this cam is rotating, you will see that these cams are moving around and that there are parts that are high up and parts that are low down. The camshaft is synchronized with the crankshaft, and that is typically through a chain or a belt, and we call this the distribution chain or the distribution belt, or the timing belt or the timing chain. There's different names used for that. If the crankshaft is rotating, it's going to drive actually the camshaft through that timing chain or that timing belt. And that's the way we're going to keep the camshaft and the crankshaft in sync. Remember that I mentioned before that the crankshaft is rotating twice as fast as the camshaft. So this camshaft is for a 4-cylinder with 2 valves per cylinder. So we have 2 cams, inlet valve, outlet valve, cylinder 1, inlet valve, outlet valve, cylinder 2, same thing for cylinder 3 and cylinder 4. So if this cam is rotating, you will see that you have these lobes coming up, and if this was a camshaft sitting on the side of the engine, like on a Formula Ford for instance, then you have a follower which is resting on this cam here, and while the camshaft is rotating, it's going to push that follower upwards until the top point right here. Now that whole movement will then open up the valve. So it is the cam or the shape of the cam here that will determine at what moment in time the valve will open up and how far it will open up. So how much opening the valve gets depends on the height of the cam, and how fast or how slow it opens up depends on the slope of the cam. So that's very important to remember, because that's going to come back once we look on the screen on the graph on how these things all work. Now, if you look very closely, and I'm going to try to show you that to you, it may be that the inlet cam and the outlet cam or the lobe are actually overlapping, basically meaning that we have a high point here and a high point there that actually would leave both valves partially open. This is what we call the overlap, and this is going to become very important on race cars because there we're talking about 320 degrees cams, we're talking about a fast cam. Sometimes you hear people talk about a high lifting cam. When they talk about a high lifting cam, they mean that these lobes are very high up, they are very high. So you open up the valves really a lot. So the whole idea of a camshaft is, as I stated before, configure these lobes or shape them in such a form that you have the maximum efficiency of your engine at a very specific RPM range. And this is what we call the power band. So if you're going to buy a camshaft, you need to keep in mind for which power band you want to buy a cam. And of course, those are very specific for very specific engines, so no cam is the same. They typically come as standard cams, mild cam, fast road cam, race cam, and so on. And the difference will be the overlap on the cams, but also the height of the cam and how much the valves stay open in terms of rotations of the cam itself. So if you're talking about the 300 degrees camshaft, that means that the inlet valve or the outlet valve will be open for 300 degrees, right? So a full circle is 360, so that valve is only closed for 60 degrees. It's not a lot, and you probably wonder why. I had some young guys coming to me and they were bragging about how fast their camshaft was. And I was just like wondering, I said like, do you realize what you're saying? Because if you put a 300 degrees camshaft in your engine, your power band is way up. It's going to be around 5,000, 7,000 RPMs. And if this car is your daily driver, it's not going to be very good for you to drive it around in the city. And in fact, in most cases, when people just change the cam because they think a fast cam is going to give a lot of improvement on the engine, they most of the time have it wrong because in many cases, it's just getting worse. And that's why I like to get back to the basics first, and then we will dig in on some real graphs and some real data from some real cams. And I will give you an explanation between a standard cam and a race cam, and you will see the difference, what will happen to your car if you fit that into your engine. All right, so let's start. Let us recap in short on how a four-stroke engine is working. So now imagine that the piston is atop that center and that we are starting the intake stroke. So the piston will be going down and it's going to suck vacuum. At that moment in time, just after top that center, we want to make sure that our inlet valve is open so we can suck in that air-fuel mixture coming from the carburetor. Once we hit the bottom dead center, that intake stroke is now done. Now we need to close that inlet valve because the piston is going to come back up. This is going to be our compression stroke. Now during the upwards movement in the compression stroke, both valves have to be closed, both the intake and the exhaust valve. So now the piston is reaching top dead center. We have maximum compression and both valves are closed. And shortly after that, we get ignition and then we get combustion. The combustion is violent and it pushes that piston back down again. During that time, the valves have to remain closed, otherwise you will lose power. So now the piston is going down again. It's now reaching the end of its labor stroke. Now the piston is coming back up, and what we need to do now is to get rid of these burnt gases as fast as we can. That is why now at the bottom dead center, the exit valve is now opening up while this piston is coming up. Piston is coming up and it's pushing out all these burnt gases into the exhaust. And then the whole cycle repeats. When the piston is at top dead center on the exhaust stroke, then the outlet valve closes, the intake valve, of course, is still closed. And then once it just gets at top dead center, then the inlet valve opens up again and we are sucking in back fresh air-fuel mixture through the carburetor while the piston is going down. So this is how a four-stroke engine is working. So you would think that the valves only open up when the piston is moving in the right direction. So intake should only happen after top dead center while the piston is going down, right? And exhaust, the exhaust valve should only open up after the piston has passed bottom dead center, because then the piston is coming up. And now in reality, that is not working too well, because you're not going to have a lot of performance, you're not going to have a lot of power coming out of that engine because of latency and other things. So therefore, in many cases, we are going to open up the intake valve even before the piston is at top dead center. So the piston is still pushing out gases, and we are already starting to open up the inlet valve. And the reason for that is that exhaust fumes are being pushed out into the exhaust. That valve is open when the piston comes up. And we're creating kind of a suction pump, because those hot gases are getting out of that cylinder. They are being pushed out. They are flowing through your exhaust. And that stream acts a bit like a vacuum pump for the inlet. So if we open up gently and slowly the inlet valve before top dead center, then we get that suction effect. So we are gaining time to fill up that cylinder, because we want to fill up that cylinder to the maximum possible extent with the air-fuel mixture to get more power. So when the piston then hits top dead center, we already have the inlet valve open, and we can now happily fill that cylinder with the new mixture when the piston is going down, by even opening up more the inlet valve. Of course, by now, the outlet valve should be closed. So when this piston is going down now, sucking in that air-fuel mixture, we're not going to close that valve at bottom dead center. We're going to close it X amount of degrees after bottom dead center. So in fact, when the piston starts moving in its compression stroke, just after bottom dead center, then we're going to close that inlet valve. So our time that our inlet valve is open is longer. We have a benefit from the suction pump, or the vacuum effect of streaming gases out of the cylinder, and we have more time to fill up that whole cylinder with the maximum amount of air-fuel mixture. And the more you can fill it up, the more efficient your car becomes. Now, this whole suction mechanism, while gases are getting out of the cylinder after the combustion, depends a lot on the rotations per minute. So on a very fast running engine, high RPMs, that suction effect is a lot bigger. Those gases are streaming out of your exhaust port real quick and high speed, high volume, because you have so many RPMs per minute that you really create a really great vacuum pump. So now we can actually give the inlet valve more advance to open up, or more degrees to open up than we would normally do. So that way we are creating a lot of power. The power band is in the high RPMs. That's where that sits. Not suitable at all for a street car. In fact, a car with a race cam is really not running very well on idle and on low RPMs. It just doesn't have a lot of power, because we don't have that suction effect enough, and we are opening up the inlet valve very, very early, and we close it very, very late. And therefore, we have some losses. So that is not working too well. And we don't only do this with the intake valve, we also do it with the exhaust valve. We are really opening up the exhaust valve within the labor stroke. Now that sounds pretty weird, right? So we had this explosion just after top dead center. The piston has been moved violently down. And then, before the piston hits bottom dead center, we start to open up already the exhaust valve. And often we do this like 20, 30, 40, 60 degrees even before it hits bottom dead center. And the reason we're opening that up is to make sure that we can get rid of all these burning gases. Now, you're probably going to say, well, you're going to lose power. No, reality is that you don't lose a lot of power. Of course, there will be a little bit of a loss, but the gains are much bigger. While this piston is going down, once it's like 3/4 down, the effect of the burning of the air-fuel mixture is gone. That force is gone. That piston has been given a push. It's like a kid on a swing, right? You just give it that push, and once that swing is going down, your push has no longer really an effect down there when the swing is like halfway or three-quarter way. So that's why we can open up already the exhaust valve. And the good thing is there is still compression in that cylinder based on that explosion. So now these gases already start to flow out before bottom dead center, because that outlet valve is slightly open. Of course, it's not wide open. This has to be carefully measured and controlled and calculated. And this is why camshafts are not all that cheap. That is why you have very different camshafts that consider all this. So now the outlet valve opens up before bottom dead center. The engine keeps running, and then the piston comes up, and it pushes out, like I explained before, those exhaust gases. And it's not going to close the exhaust valve before top dead center, but actually after top dead center, again to create that flow. And now you can see that both the inlet valve and the outlet valve are both open, right? Just after the exhaust cycle. That is the overlap. Now, the overlap creates, and you probably can imagine, it's kind of a tunnel, right? So we're pushing a lot of hot gases out, we're forcing that out because the piston is going up. At the same time, the inlet valve is partially open, so we're creating kind of this suction effect out. So this is how that really works. Now, it is important for high-speed cams or race cams that you have a non-restrictive exhaust. If your exhaust system is not right, then you're not going to get this high-speed flow, then you're going to lose power, because then you actually may push back some exhaust gases into your inlet valve, and this is not what you want to do. So that would not work on a normal street car, because there you always have a restrictive exhaust. That is also why you see on race cars and people that develop exhaust and headers that they measure these tubes on the exhaust. So they want to make them sure they all have the same length. And that is to get a steady, nice, high-speed flow, unrestricted of burned exhaust gases, creating this huge suction pump on high RPMs, so we can fill up that cylinder very quickly with a lot of air-fuel mixture by opening up the inlet valve way, way early. So now let's look on a couple of graphs. We're going to compare actually a race camshaft from Kent with a standard issue camshaft. And we'll look at both, and then we look at the differences. And hopefully that will bring some clarity on which cam you should buy for your car. So let's start. So what I have on the screen, guys, is a spreadsheet for a camshaft, the 720 SP. Now the 720 SP is a camshaft for race purposes, and it's applicable for a BMC MGB 1.8. Now, as I said before, if you're looking for a camshaft, you need to look for your specific car, because it's different from car to car. Now let's have a look on what we see here on this spreadsheet. On the top part, of course, we have the part number, which is quite clear, BMC, engine type 1.8 liter. The description, it's intended for race purposes. And as you can see, our power band, as I mentioned before, is between 4,000 and 7,500 RPM. So this cam is really going to perform very well in the high RPMs, but lousy in the low RPMs. So let's have a quick look now on the specifications about the cam lift. And you remember in the video before that I showed you the lift, the height of the cam? Well, this is going to cause the cam lift here on this car will result in an 8.2 millimeter lift of the inlet valve and an 8.43 millimeter on the exhaust valve. That is important to know. The duration, meaning how long is the valve open? The inlet valve is open for 300 degrees and the exhaust valve for 308 degrees. The duration of the inlet valve at 1 millimeter opening, because that's kind of a standard, is 260 degrees and 270 for the exhaust. We will achieve full lift of the valve, so maximum open at 104 top dead center. So this is for the inlet valve, and the A stands for after top dead center. The lift before top dead center is at 3.68 millimeters for the inlet valve, And now we're coming to the timing. So the timing is important. So we're going to open up the inlet valve at 46 degrees before top dead center, and we're going to close it 74 degrees after bottom dead center. For the exhaust, we will open up the exhaust 80 degrees before bottom dead center and 40 degrees after top dead center. We will close it. And don't worry about it. We'll have a closer look on a graph in a few seconds to explain all this. And then, of course, you can see the valve lift in millimeters. So there's always a difference between cam lift and valve lift. And this is the actual valve lift. The cam lift is how high the cam really is, whereas the valve lift determines how wide the valves are opening up. And then, as you can see here, the inlet valve is 11.07, exhaust 11.32 millimeters. And then finally, we have the valve clearance, the VC, and here you can see the clearance is to be set for your specific configuration. So you need to remember all these things once you're selecting a camshaft, because the valve lift can be a problem for your engine if your engine is not sorted out. And typically you will find additional information on these sheets of other parts you're going to need, like followers and push rods and rockers and the ratios related to that. So keep that in mind. So the standard camshaft typically has a power band between 1000 and 5500 RPM. So on the graph, we got the top dead center, we have the bottom dead center, and then we have the degrees. So 0 degrees or 360, 90 degrees, 180, 270. So let's assume we start with a inlet cycle or an intake stroke. So we know the piston is just reaching top dead center, and before the piston is hitting top dead center, within the exhaust stroke, 20 degrees before we are at top dead center, we start to open up the inlet valve, which is the orange part. So now the piston hits top dead center. Piston is going down, and we keep opening up the inlet valve until we have full lift at 160 degrees after top dead center. Now at full lift, the piston is going further down, sucking in this air-fuel mixture. It hits the bottom dead center. We now start the compression cycle, and the valve isn't closed yet. We let it open for a little bit to keep on filling that cylinder. And at 52 degrees past bottom dead center, we actually have the inlet valve fully closed. So now the piston moves up in its compression stroke. It hits top dead center. We get now explosion, combustion. Piston is flying down, labor stroke. Now, at the labor stroke moment, we now will open up the outlet valve 55 degrees before bottom dead center. So while we are still in the labor stroke, while the piston is still going down, we will open up that valve, as you can see. So we get enough gases out, and we got sufficient pressure in the cylinder to start pushing these gases out. Now remember, the valve is not fully open, it just starts to open up. So piston now hits the bottom dead center, and 106 degrees after bottom dead center, we have the full lift of the exhaust valve. Piston keeps moving up, it's now pushing out those gases violently out of the cylinder. And at 20 degrees before top dead center, we open up already our inlet valve. And here we make a benefit of this overlap of this suction moment. Our outlet valve is only going to close 70 degrees after top dead center. So this gives you pretty much an idea on how these overlaps are working and how we can use it to our benefit. So now let's have a look on a race camshaft, and this is the camshaft that I showed you before. I have just plotted all these figures here onto that graph. So now let's assume that the piston was coming up basically, and pushing out the gases. So we are at the exhaust stroke. So when the piston at the exhaust stroke is hitting 46 degrees before top dead center, we start to open up the inlet valve. Piston goes up, goes up, goes up. And remember, the outlet valve is also open. At top dead center, our inlet valve keeps opening up more and more and more. And we have full lift of our inlet valve at about 104 degrees after top dead center. Now the piston is going down and sucking in this air fuel mixture through the carburetor. And now the piston is hitting basically the bottom dead center. We don't close the valve yet, but the valve is on its way to be closed. And it's only after 74 degrees after bottom dead center in the compression stroke that we start closing the inlet valve. Now you can see that we have done 300 degrees of opening for the inlet valve, and this allows us to fill up that cylinder to the maximum possible extent. And the only way we can do this is because we have this suction pump working. And you can see that we have a huge overlap here between the inlet and the outlet valve, and that is giving us exactly that suction effect. And this allows us to keep those two valves open together for a long time. Now, on the bottom part, there is no overlap. Although it says overlap, there is really no overlap. There's only an overlap on the exhaust and intake. So our piston was going up, as we said, and now we've got the combustion moment. Piston is going down, 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 down. And now when the piston is at 80 degrees before bottom dead center, we start to open up the outlet valve. And we start pushing out the gases. Piston goes down, goes down, goes down, hits the bottom dead center. Now the piston goes back up and it keeps pushing out those gases as fast as it can. Now it creates a lot of airflow in the exhaust, and we are almost hitting now top dead center at the exhaust stroke. And now at 40 degrees before top dead center, we start to open up again the inlet valve, because that's where we commence our intake cycle. And as you can see, both valves are now open. This is the overlap, as I just mentioned. And only when our piston is past 80 degrees top dead center, we close fully the outlet valve. So in other words, we have a huge suction moment right here. And that is why it only works at high RPMs. I've put the two together so you can actually see the difference. So let's look on that. On this slide, you can see the difference between the race camshaft and the standard camshaft. And as you can see, the solid colors, that's the race camshaft. So the inlet is the orange, 300 degrees for the inlet valve, and the blue one is 308 degrees for the exhaust valve. The orange with the lines and the blue with the lines, that's for the standard camshaft. And the most important part is right here on the top. You can see that there is a major difference between the inlet valve of a standard and a race camshaft. So the race camshaft opens a lot earlier and it also closes later. And the same thing goes for the exhaust valve. We keep the exhaust valve longer open on the race camshaft than what we do on a standard camshaft. And again, we open up the outlet valve earlier on the race camshaft and later on the standard camshaft. So there is a big difference between them, and this is what I wanted to tell you. Keep that in mind if you ever going to buy a camshaft. Pay attention to the power band and the other elements that you're going to need to achieve and install a race or a fast road or a mild camshaft, because you may have to do some additional work on your engine to fit them in. But just don't go for a race camshaft just because it sounds good, because it's not going to be drivable daily for a daily driver. So thank you very much, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye bye.